Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Emma Silverman, the Cultural Resources Program Manager for Capital District of California State Parks. I am so pleased to be introducing today's Sutter Sport Collection Research in Progress Lunchtime Talk, Relics of Hubris, Objects and Images of Survival in 1846 by Sienna Weldon. As with most museums, the majority of state park museum collections are in storage rather than on public display. This is especially true for Sutter's Fort, which has one of the largest museum collections in the state park system, but currently has very little exhibit space on site that is safe for delicate historic objects. The Sutter's Fort Collections Research in Progress webinar series aims to bring the rich histories told by Sutter's Fort's collection to the public through the presentation of cutting-edge research on the historic objects and structures that we steward. The first installment in this webinar series was presented by Nathan Wentz in August of 2024. His talk, An Industrial Army at Sutter's Fort, How Graffiti Brings Forgotten Events to Light, showcased his original research on graffiti in the attic of the Sutter's Fort Central building and illuminated its connections to 19th century labor history. You can view Nathan's talk on the Sutter's Fort YouTube channel, and we'll be dropping that link in the chat. Here at State Parks, we are so fortunate to have many early career professionals who work with us in part-time or project-based roles. These budding curators and historians often become preoccupied with the intricacies of our parks collections, and the talk you'll hear today by Sienna Weldon is no exception. Sienna is an independent scholar, an art history lecturer at colleges in the greater Sacramento region, and a curatorial assistant for California State Parks. Sienna's research explores the visual and material culture connected to the early Hawaiian monarchy, decolonial theory, and Euro-American maritime history more broadly. Sienna received her master's in art history from the University of California, Davis in 2023. She recently co-chaired a panel at the College Art Association's annual conference. Sienna's panel, titled Toward a Pacific Turn in American Art History, sought to critically subvert Atlantic-centered narratives in the discipline. Sienna has also held a curatorial fellowship at the New Bedford Whaling Museum in Massachusetts and was previously an archives fellow with Capital District. Sienna's talk today builds on her passion project interest in British Arctic expeditions as it aligns with her work with California State Parks. Before I hand it over to Sienna, a couple of housekeeping reminders. This talk is being recorded for those who cannot attend live. We will be sending you all a link to the recording, and it will also be posted on the Sutter's Fort YouTube for others to enjoy. Sienna's talk is about a half an hour long, and then we will have time for question and answer. Please drop your questions either in the Q&A box or in the chat so that Sienna can address those at the conclusion of her talk. And with that, I will hand it off to Sienna.
Okay, thank you, Emma, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you so much for attending my presentation. It's an honor to have the opportunity to speak to you all today about a subject that has consumed me for months, as well as an incredible privilege to work for and in perpetuation of California State Parks, who, among other things, stewards the largest repository of Donner-related artifacts. Since graduating with my master's, my personal research interests have been relegated, perhaps limited, to their foundation in 19th century imperial British maritime ventures. Thus, it has truly been rewarding for me to have found a way to marry my passion for this subject to my day job. The research I've conducted has served as a reminder that the power of historical connectivity can be present in what might initially seem like diametrically opposed subjects, even in the elements you least expect. I hope that by the conclusion of my presentation, you'll share the same sentiment. And with that, let's get started. Snow, ice, starvation, and silence. This was the backdrop of the winter of 1846 to 47 in two very different places of the globe, the California-Nevada border and the Arctic Circle. In the spring of 1846, a wagon train comprised of several optimistic emigrant men, women, and children started their trek from Independence, Missouri to the promised paradise of California, and specifically Sutter's Fort. To make this journey was no small feat, but the prospect of a new life out west invigorated their spirits, even along the vastness of the Wyoming wilderness and into the Great Salt Lake Desert in Utah. They were urged by the ill-advised to take an alternate shortcut route known as the Hastings Cutoff in order to make up for lost time. This would prove detrimental when setback after setback meant that they hadn't made it through the Sierra Nevada mountains before snowfall. An uncharacteristically early arrival of winter had started to set in, keeping the bedraggled party from making any further progress. From Alder Creek to Truckee Lake, the deteriorating Breen, Graves, Reed, Murphy, Eddy families, and a handful of solo travelers made crude shelters out of what they could in hopes they would survive till spring. But as snow kept falling for 5 long months and hard times continued to compound, those remaining had to make an impossible decision: eat or die trying. For 48 of the 89 people who originally began this exploit of manifest destiny, that outcome was to live. That same winter, a chillingly similar case was unfolding across the landscape of what is now the territory of Nunavut in the Canadian Arctic. It's here on the ancestral lands of the Inuit that British Royal Navy officer Sir John Franklin and his crew of 128 men were stranded for an indeterminate number of years, while his 2 ships, HMS Terror and Erebus, were stuck and icebound in Victoria Strait. They struggled and ultimately succumbed to exposure, starvation, and scurvy. Of those 129 men, none survived. Stranded in snow or locked in ice, these 2 concurrent groupings of people were stuck and made immobile by fear in the face of certain death. In both instances, this fear was forcibly contrasted so poetically with the awe and beauty of nature's terrific splendor, that there is great tragedy inherent in succumbing to the elements should not be remiss here. But these 2 events, which might seem congruent on the onset, or incongruent on the onset, share more than just a corresponding year of catastrophic climax. Fundamentally, they mirror each other in regard to aspirations, loftiness, and perhaps most perversely, principle. Because both parties were in search of a cutoff, a way over, around, and through, whether it be in the name of science, empire, or a new way of life in a place more foreign to them than the stars. In this process, they left behind remnants of themselves and thus left their mark on 2 very different landscapes, literally and figuratively. In haste to either be rescued or perish, physical objects, which will be referred to as relics, were forgotten and forgone, where they remained undisturbed until their accession into repositories like the National Maritime Museum Greenwich and California State Parks. My research emerged when I began to take note of a great blurred divide between how these things were remembered compared to their reference. I saw that a subversion was necessary to the scholarly coverage of both the Donner Party and Franklin's journey to find the Northwest Passage. For too long, historians have grown comfortable with excusing a historically pacifist treatment of both events as it relates to the violence central to settler colonialism. I postulate that this has been exacerbated by the fact that the casualties in both of these cases were brought about by radical climate and thus present themselves as more neutrally or even divinely derived. But as political scientist and author Mary Stuckey asserts, nature's ability to trap and immobilize those most extrinsic to it is vastly antithetical to the nationalistic ideological structure of American society, especially in the 19th century. Subject to the uncontrollable will of the environment, any sense of supposed self-control is vulnerable to subjugation. Some just learn this the hard way. Thus, today I argue for the consideration of the salience of things left behind. That is, the debris of colonial vanity and the wreckage inherent to state-sponsored hubris. That such odds and ends of rust and rope are just as, if not more, capable of relaying nuanced stories of loss and legacy than shipwrecks nestled on the bottom of Earth's shallowest ocean, or the paper trail of letters and manuscripts written and sent by people in the Donner Party rescue reliefs is, to me at least, compelling. For the Donner fragments that make up an ironically small fraction of the California State Park's Sutter's Fort collection, this research is a chance to step out of storage and into the limelight. Compared to other more iconic Donner Party objects, such as the infamous Patty Reed doll, which you see on screen, bits of broken flatware or rusted rings and nuts do not quite garner equitable amounts of attention. But does that make them irrelevant or ignoble? In order to exemplify this idea, I present a selection of objects and images that hold space for narratives in the absence of those who can still tell them. It cannot be ignored that these images and objects were powerful in the immediate historical aftermath of their corresponding event and still have the ability to shape our contemporary perspective on feats of survival against all odds. They potently embody a prevailing Victorian ideology grounded in the complexities between the spectator and the spectated. What's more, they urge us to stop, pause, and ask ourselves, what more can be gleaned from an analysis of what remains? Why do we continue to be so enraptured with the perils of the sublime? And perhaps most pressingly, what do we learn from tragedy and how do we react to that? The challenge of such insuperable questions has compelled me to dig that much deeper. But in order to situate these so-called relics, we must first establish a working understanding of what caused, what occurred, and what compelled an enshrinement of what the human condition looks like at its limits. I'm sure that in present company, the Donner Party needs no introduction. Still, though, I seek to nestle the intricate context of these concurrent degrees of hardship within each other in order to recognize their nuance. We will begin first with the consideration of the Lost Franklin expedition. Hailing from Spilsby, England, Sir John Franklin was a man of considerable renown in both the authority of the Royal Navy, as well as circles of Victorian society. As the Royal Navy was gearing up to fund and justify another expedition to find the Northwest Passage, John Franklin's name naturally emerged as a viable option. Franklin was already 60 at the start of the expedition, quite old by naval officer standards, but his prior experience as celebrated polar explorer, veteran of the War of 1812, and even the lieutenant governor of Van Diemen's Land in Australia for a stint of time made him one of the ideal candidates for this voyage. Under Franklin's overarching leadership, the Admiralty appointed the younger James Fitzjames to serve as second in command to Franklin on HMS Erebus, while Irishman Francis Crozier captained Terror. This way, even with a fleet of 2 ships, the expedition was commanded accordingly. The mission was fairly straightforward. Find the Northwest Passage, the infamous yet seemingly mythical navigable route through Arctic waters, which theoretically spat you out into the Pacific on the other side of the world. The English hoped that in doing so, a shortened, more favorable route to the Pacific might prove beneficial for trade and commerce. Thus, their journey was just as much concerned with the perpetuation of science and technology as it was with propagating the hegemony of the empire. On May 19th, 1845, the ships HMS Terror and Erebus left the waters of Greenhithe, pointed northwest. By July, they had made it to Baffin Bay, close to Greenland, and were last spotted by a whaling vessel awaiting passage at the mouth of Lancaster Sound. Even in the summer months, smooth sailing in Arctic waters could be easily impeded by ice floes, of which Terror and Erebus encountered. Oh, sorry. They overwintered on Beechy Island during the winter of 1845, and when the ice opened up in the spring, they continued sailing through the passage until September of 1846. Then all was halted. Caught in ice well off the coast of King William Island, which at this time the British believed to be a peninsula, the crews of Terror and Erebus were subject to an unseasonably early affront of freezing, preventing them from making further progress. Forced to hunker down in their immobile ships, Franklin and crew were hopeful that come April of 1847, they'd be out of this mess and well on their way through the passage. Not quite. Spring and summer came, but without warmer winds. Over 10 months passed before it became apparent that the most reasonable thing to do was abandon the ships and attempt to make the inconceivably long journey south to a British outpost in hopes of staying alive. After sitting still long enough, the call was made to pack the boat sleds and haul their gear as far as they could. Needless to say, this probably looked like a comedy of errors, emphasis on probably, as we are absent any documentation that attests to the experience. In fact, the last written testament that offers any sort of personal perspective of the Franklin crew comes from the Victory Point Note, a document that had originally been placed in a cairn on shore in 1847, then retrieved and amended almost exactly a year later in 1848, to record that Sir John had died on June 11th, 1847, and that both ships were officially abandoned under the command of impromptu captains Crozier and Fitzjames. A passage from the first drafted message just a few weeks before Franklin's death encapsulates the epitome of their arrogance. Quote, 28th of May, 1847, Her Majesty's ships Erebus and Terror wintered in the ice, Sir John Franklin commanding the expedition, all well. As you can surmise, all was very much not well, at least not completely and not for very long. The men were dying slowly but surely. The provisions meant to last them 3 years had already been tapped into, and there was no conceivable way they could make it across the austere landscape of the Arctic to any known shelter south of them. We know not what that surely agonizing procedure looked like, but the end result was fatal. Compared to the Donner Party plight, which occurred over the span of 5 months of winter of 1846 to 47, Franklin's men endured an ordeal longer than just one winter, which naturally hindered their chance of survival. What's more, the remote location of King William Land made it that much more impossible to achieve the hope of rescue. Certain circumstances predicated the kinds of objects we'll be looking at. Concurrently, members of the Donner Party thought they were in search of paradise, a Western utopia away from the already well-settled East with abundant land and better climate. The labor skill sets of various members of the Donner Party made them prime targets for California's Siren's Call, and even more so, the journey had been sold to them as one fit for families. By no means was this journey undertaken without sacrifice, but the fact that many wagon trains had already traversed the emigrant route from Missouri to Oregon in the years prior to 1846 acted as a balm for numerous anxieties. Still, trouble along the Hastings Cutoff through the unfamiliar terrain of what is now Utah and Nevada slowed their progress, forcing them to abandon key supplies in order to lighten their load. Even with all of that, they were still behind just enough to fall victim to an unruly and unpredictable winter, one that would be the source of several of their demises. Many camped in the remnants of cabins built by immigrants before them and hunkered down for a few brutal months. Because there were survivors of this ordeal, we know much more about the context of each site and essentially had more to extrapolate from it. We have a clear enough understanding of where each campsite was, what trees they cut down for supplies, what they ate until they couldn't render down their animal hides anymore. But what really propels a keen understanding of this disaster is the fact that we have written testimony in the form of journals and diaries that speaks to what it felt like to go through this, the hopes, the fears, and the fallout. Years later, these accounts would circulate in the general public and drum up both positive and negative sentiment towards these individuals, and then later help solidify their relevance and elevate their celebrity. Thus, there are answers in these journals as numerous as there are mysteries. The same cannot be said about Franklin. For years following, a total of 39 British expedition teams sought to first rescue, then broadly locate, then haphazardly recover any trace of Franklin's presence left on King William Island. The parameters and priorities of these internationally supplied reconnaissance teams shifted as time passed and the fate of Franklin's crew became certain. By 1854, the British surgeon turned explorer John Ray turned to local Inuit for first-hand testimony. Ray's team asked them in broken Inuktitut, quote, "We are in search of 2 English ships, which have been 5 years in the ice. Have you heard anything of such ships? Should you meet any white men, treat them kindly, and you shall be rewarded." To which they responded that yes, they had, and it hadn't been a pretty sight. They spoke of encountering nearly 30 corpses near Back's Great Fish River, emaciated from malnutrition and scurvy, of which they sought to treat in a last-ditch effort by resorting to cannibalism. Up to this point, Inuit testimony of witnessing the crew's descent to their ultimate demise firsthand had been largely ignored, written off as conjecture and propagated by colonial racism. Never mind the presence of Inuit-adapted knives and ulus made from retrofitted scrap metal Franklin's men had left behind as they marched south, which seemed to suggest interaction between the two groups. No one wanted to believe that these men of great renown would have succumbed to a sin as reprehensible as consuming their own countrymen. Frankly, it threatened the sanctity of a supposed English character, yet it did not tamper wild imaginations. One such notion of what the last days of Franklin's crew might have looked like is featured in a large-scale oil painting by Edwin Landseer titled "Man Proposes, God Disposes," completed in 1864. Inspired by accounts from the numerous rescue expeditions and an unfailing Victorian fascination with the mystery of it all, Landseer is quoted as having been directly compelled by reports from the McClintock expedition of 1858, which spoke of encountering several skeletal remains in a dilapidated boat that had been ravaged by animals. This was a sort of manufactured explanation as to why many of the found bodies on King William Island seemed to show signs of mauled violence. And the salience of the polar bear motif fulfilled its role in fashioning a particular flavor of horror. Here we see two polar bears gallivanting amongst the wreckage of a ship on land. One tears what appears to be the sail from the mast, while the other munches on a set of human rib bones. And curiously, in the bottom left-hand corner, you can just make out a discarded telescope, inspired by a telescope artifact found on site and brought back to England, stored as a relic of the expedition before it eventually its eventual endowment to a relative of Franklin's. Besides this subtle inclusion, the scene is entirely unrealistic. Neither Terror nor Erebus ever ran ashore. Instead, they both were busy sitting at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean and would remain that way until their discovery in 2014. Visual narratives of the Donner Party have been less prolific, but by no means less effective. Take this work by William Gilbert Gall titled On the Way to the Summit, for example. In it, Gall envisions a fairly abstracted window into the Donners' harrowing escapade up the Sierra Nevada mountains. Vegetation is sparse and relegated to the upper right corner between rock forms, while whispers of figural forms huddled under shadowy blankets contrast well with the stark white of the snow. The composition is rendered with a unique use of perspective to emphasize the enormity of the summit, and this is as purposeful as it is effective. It's unknown whether Gall conceived of this work in consultation with survivor accounts of those who aided the rescue missions, or if he leaned exclusively on his working knowledge of the disaster through sheer cultural exposure. Yet still, I find it interesting that he was drawn to the dynamism of their physical struggle rather than a more horrific, stagnant view that would have emphasized the Donner Party's suffering. For that, he could have painted a hypothetical scene of their camp or emphasized the disparities in gender and age of the people that made up the survivors. But what he did is much more interesting than that, I think. I look at this work and am struck by its belief in their perseverance rather than their downfall. I am equally compelled by the historiography of both the Donner-Reed and Franklin trials. That is the history of the way these ordeals have been recounted, repurposed, and relegated to the annals of history. Urged by my perspective as a Californian whose exposure to the Donner Party began when my fourth grade history curriculum featured Rachel Largard's fictitious retelling of the life of Patty Reed Stahl, which you can learn more about Patty Reed Stahl in our recently released YouTube video, which we'll drop a link in the chat. I started to ponder, at what point do these elements of history become codified as fact in our culture, and how informed are they by fiction? In response to absence, English and American societies in the mid to late 19th century yearned for the melodramatic, which applied to both how these histories were disseminated as well as how they treated the objects that proved that they actually occurred. Both Donner Party and Franklin relics went on tour, physically and in print, sating what had been coined as the Victorian exhibitionary complex of seeing and being seen. This is all in line with the Victorian culture of antiquarianism, or an affinity for the antique, however near or far one stood to the historical climax in question. The language used to identify the supposed rarity of these objects derives from this prevailing mindset and helped ensure their status as phantom leftovers of importance. In England, the 1891 Royal Naval Exhibition was instrumental in curating the public perception of Franklin's folly, even decades later. Facilitated by the Admiralty and held on the grounds of the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, the RNE's exhibition aimed to highlight the grandeur of the Empire's naval efforts over a large swath of time. Of course, the dubbed Franklin Wing, or the Franklin Gallery, warranted a particular level of spectacle. A so-called tableau of the human condition was constructed, complete with 4 wax mannequins dressed in parkas and snow goggles, engaged in dragging a sledge across a mocked-up iceberg. And on the walls around the scene, the Franklin relics were exhibited. The clear stated goal of this corner of the expo was to, quote, help the visitor realize the great Arctic tragedy associated with the explorer's honored name. The whole effort proved to be resoundingly salient, imparting a renewed interest in the ordeal near the turn of the century, nearly 50 years later. Treatment of the Donner Party relics followed the same sort of circuit. Even as early as a year post-rescue, groups of tourists flocked to what remained of the Donner cabins in search of loot. What they found instead were remnants of a harrowing experience. Nails that held up the makeshift cabins, nuts to the dismantled wagon wheels, and fractured flatware they had hoped to have used in California had things not gone so awry. Like scavenger ants, these macabre excursionists swept up the relics, then swiftly commercialized them, displaying them in a manner as you see on screen, on paper placards denoting their function, and ascriptions to particular figures in the Donner Party survival narrative. No singular person was more fortuitous in obtaining these relics than Truckee resident C.F. McGlashan, a known xenophobe famous for leading the Truckee Coalition for Anti-Chinese Sentiment. When he wasn't perpetuating horrific violence against the immigrant Chinese community in Northern California, he busied himself with writing a chronology of the history of the Donner Party, which he later published in 1879. If you can make it out on the images on screen, you'll note that these placards all say, by C.F. McGlashan at the very bottom. Of the ones in the Sutter's Fort collection, of the ones in our Sutter's Fort collection, they're overwhelmingly attributed to the Breen cabin. Spurred on by prolific testaments from survivors, many of whom were children in 1846, the appeal of this mad dash to amass Donner Party souvenirs served to cement the relevance of displaying objects with lamentable stories. When I apply the term relic to these two disasters, I seek to probe at the perhaps uncomfortable prospect of the past and present deification of historical figures, and then actively critique it. We usually reserve the word for bones of saints, held in gilded reliquaries, but would it be sacrilegious to do the same for objects and artifacts of disaster? On first glance, these objects might look insignificant, waste even. Crumpled bits of tin that once were cans, weathered leather, splinters of wood, and curled wire, you name it. These severed, incomplete things are contrasted by those that have retained their wholeness: rusted scissors, uniform buttons, a doll, a comb, a dinner knife. Of the spoons you see on screen, C.F. McGlashan, the spoon that you see that's attributed to the Donner Party, C.F. McGlashan wrote that, "Here are spoons which are bent and rust-eaten, some of which are partially without bowls, and some destitute of handles, the missing portions being vaguely shadowed in the rust-stained earth in which they were embedded." Latent within this statement is an effort to concoct a fully fleshed out life for the spoon's existence amid speculation, forming the myth that somehow still possesses the truth. All of the relics are thus subject to similarly constructed narratives. That they were relics called in the 19th century when they were closest to their creation should mean something to us. It's a form of propaganda. As we've seen throughout, both Franklin and Donner relics functioned as tools of remembrance as well as a forewarning, whether it be the treatment of survivors of the Donner Party, who went on to be heralded on levels akin to folk hero sainthood, or the legacy of Franklin's maritime men, equally mourned and then enshrined by the nation. Other images, particularly paintings, helped materialize another unique through line between these events: how horror is perpetuated by an inflexible, unforgiving landscape. With the landscape as our set design, the relics start to feel more like characters in a narrative production, rather than just disjointed pieces of rubbish. This is very much intentional. We're invited to get lost in the pull and appeal of the impossible shale, sprawling white that stretches into infinity, yet still haunted by the uncanny feeling that things could have been different. Had they packed better? Had they listened or not listened to the opinions of others? Had they waited and known the signs of Mother Nature's divine intervention, perhaps they could have lived. They all could have lived. But both instances should be taken in stride. That one cannot rely on sheer hope to keep you warm in a snowstorm seems to be the overarching moral of imagining these disasters. When we concern ourselves with the allure of the sublime, we run the risk of falling victim to its perils. But it's somehow still innately human to reflect these stories back on ourselves. Can we envision ourselves in their well-worn shoes? Would we have found a way to overcome the elements? What choices would we make if faced with the impossible? And what would we choose to carry with us as well as leave behind? To conclude, I want to touch on the point of saliency and materiality, the why should we care of it all. These odds and ends do not amass to much physically, yet still take up space in collections such as ours. Should that even be? To that, I say, consult the relics and connect them to their living, breathing legacies, which manage to retain their relevance today, albeit subject to more directed, comprehensive critique. Today at Donner Memorial State Park, and specifically at the site where the Breen cabin once stood, a statue has been erected to honor the pioneers who crossed the Sierra on their way to the west. And in Nunavut, Parks Canada has decreed the still sunken ships of Terror and Erebus as a National Historic Site and still treats them as an active archaeological site. Then, in as recent as September of last year, forensic archaeologists have positively identified the remains of Captain James Fitzjames, whose bones were found in a heap of 400 others belonging to at least 13 individual members of the expedition. Lacerations on Fitzjames' jawbone were consistent with the type of incision marks seen in instances of cannibalism, thus confirming that long-held anxiety of the true dissolvement of Victorian English propriety. A mandible, I would argue, too, is a kind of relic. I say this all to emphasize the most grounding part of research to me, that we are still unraveling these mysteries. We are still piecing together fragments of understanding from relative nothingness, and we will continue to do so, which should be as formidable a prospect as it is intriguing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sienna, for that fantastic talk. That was amazing and so thought-provoking. I invite everyone in the audience to pop any questions or comments that you might have in the chat. I see that Kim has already written amazing, and I see lots of hand clapping. To get us started off with the Q&A, Sienna, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what inspired you to put these two events in conversation with one another. I think you did a really great work to kind of convince us of their shared resonance. But where did you start? What was your sort of seed of inspiration to put this talk together?
That's a great question. I'm going to kind of give you two answers to that. One, I have this passion, particularly for the Franklin exhibition or expedition, and in just sort of my knowledge, I kind of put two and two together. Okay, 1846, we kind of have like a chronological crossover, and kind of combining the realization that these events were, predicated on the fact that like a natural disaster, that being the very cold winter of 1846, bound them together, I thought was really interesting in two very different parts of the globe. But on a sort of sentimental note, it was actually the day that it was announced that James Fitzjames' mandible was positively attributed to him through DNA connection. On that day in September last year, I was sitting working at Parks, and we had a researcher come who was looking at Donner Party documents. And so I got the notification that this British explorer that I'm obsessed with has been, positively attributed his remains. And then I kind of reflected that I work in a repository that has these amazing objects that I've already kind of identified, have some sort of through line through this connection that I previously mentioned. And it just kind of came to me like, I feel like I have to make a proposal to speak on this, that there's something to be gleaned here by connecting the two and holding them in conversation. So it's sort of like a, idea, but one that I think is kind of like cosmically aligned to have wound me up here.
Thank you for sharing that anecdote. I feel like the research process often has those little twists of fate that can lead you in a really productive direction. So thank you for sharing that. I also want to ask, I feel like you did such a great job of making the argument that these fragments of survival became relics through display in museums, displays that promoted myths undergirded by problematic ideologies of empire and settler colonialism. At the same time, I am so struck by the way that you really drew out meaning from these seemingly sort of inconsequential little fragments. We have so many items in the collection that, we expend our resources to steward in perpetuity that may not initially be as like visually compelling as, say, a big oil painting. And so I guess I was just curious for your thoughts on whether or not you think that state parks should ever display the fragments of the Donner Party. And if so, how would we put these items on display in a way that kind of subverts the narrative as it's been constructed?
Absolutely. I love this question. I've thought deeply about it. I think that in the case of the Donner Party, there's a lot of misconceptions. We sort of relegate the horrific aspect of it when we kind of herald the feats of cannibalism and what that looks like and feels like. And sure, that has merit, but the Donner Party sort of has this associations with this kind of macabre history. And in many ways, I feel like the retelling of that and our sort of like contemporary understanding of that is in and of itself fragmented. And so I feel that in displaying the fragments that we have in our collection of glass and wood and little nuts and bolts, we could sort of cut the conversation with we have all of these misconceptions that we try to thread together and create some sort of sense of wholeness, but it really is still so compartmentalized and disjointed. And what would it look like? We could kind of have an audience participation aspect of it, of encouraging visitors to imagine what it would look like if we retain some sort of wholeness about the plight of the Donner Party, and view it from an angle that isn't just with these little minute details, but as a collective whole to better understand the complexities of it. And I think the complexities of that are the perpetuation of settler colonial violence, particularly in Northern California. So you could make that tether and that connection through the fact that we have fragmented knowledge with the physical fragments themselves.
Great, thank you. We'll talk to you more when we start putting exhibits for Sutter Sport. I see a question from Kim in the chat. Kim asks, have you seen any connections between the collection display of the relics with the rise of anthropology, archaeology, and museum practice? Or is the display more of a Victorian curiosity cabinet money-making venture and their fascination with memento mori?
That is so great. Thank you, Kim. I think it's a little bit of both, and when I was in the trenches of research, I found it really interesting that for the case of the Donner Party, all of the objects, the materiality that remains of the Donner Party was all written from the perspective of archaeologists, less to do with historians, no art historians chiming in. It was very much this sort of like clinical angle of archaeology. Contrast that with the Franklin expedition, and I feel like it's a much more multidisciplinary approach subject. Including archaeologists who are, physically removing, but then the people who make meaning from it much more, hold titles of historian or art historian. So I found that quite interesting, and I'm not quite sure if I've landed on a distinct justification for that. I think that there's certainly room to open up the category and have other folks with other perspectives and disciplinary expertise chime in. So yeah, I would love to, with our capacity in state parks, kind of flip the script and find a way to tie it to cultural resources through material culture a little bit more than that. I think oftentimes objective angle that maybe archaeology might provide.
Thank you. Yeah, I was struck by how evidentiary the tags look. So right. That's really helpful for understanding that. Thank you. There's also a question from Jessica who says, thank you, Sienna. I'm struck by the prevalence of domestic and personal objects in both collections. Could you comment on whether you think this helps to humanize those lost in an inhumane landscape?
Absolutely. I think, particularly for the case of the Franklin expedition, the fact that those domestic objects, I feel like I've seen images of the China plates that are sitting at the bottom of the Arctic so many times that it really is, I feel, circulated and was circulated in the 19th century, from 1846, let's just say, to the end of the century, that this appeal to feeling bad for, holding sympathy, space for sympathy for these men of hubris. And I think that the propaganda latent in that is something that I'm interested in parsing out more. And I feel like the conversation is starting to light up. We're much more cognizant of that. And I think too, particularly for I felt this too, so I recognize my own bias, but objects that the domestic objects that pertain to eating are kind of treated in a category of their own. So the forks and knives and the bits of china, porcelain, of the plates, it also has this sort of energy to it because we have these held beliefs and close associations with the cannibalism that occurred. So it's something that we can actively critique and acknowledge. I think that the disservice to the discipline would be to fail to recognize that or try to excuse it, instead kind of acknowledging that the way in which these things went on tour and were exhibited were certainly to garner sympathy and justification for either the imperial project or manifest destiny, right? That these men and women and children were just trying to perpetuate their duty as countrymen or Americans, right? So excellent. I think about that a lot for sure.
Sienna, you have a question from Ileana, who asks, can you talk about how artists responded to these two tragedies by painting so many images at the event? And I wanted to add, thank you for that question, Ileana. I was also going to ask you why you think there are more paintings of the Franklin expedition than the Donner Party, if that has to do with the fact that there were survivors of the Donner Party and not the Franklin expedition. But yeah, if you could speak to artistic fine arts renderings of the two events, and then perhaps the discrepancy in the number of images of both.
Absolutely. That became apparent to me immediately when I was combing through what we held in our collection for the Donner Party, what other institutions hold in terms of visual culture, two-dimensional visual culture. I think a lot of it can be attributed to the fact that in the case of the Donner Party, we do have survivor narratives which speak for themselves on a different level. Of course, there was also sort of controversy in terms of the immediate aftermath of the questioning of whether or not cannibalism actually occurred. Whose accounts can we actually, take as gospel? There was a little bit more shuffling because there were people left to answer for the consequences of this, right? So I think that the Donner Party kind of got relegated to a reliance on oral testimony and then written testimony of the journal entries, and Donner Party, particularly Donner Party children who experienced the events as children when they grew up, they wrote their memoirs that attested to this. It's on the flip side for the Franklin expedition. It's really interesting that beyond visual culture too, in terms of painting or art history, the Donner Party or the Franklin expedition kind of got filtered through this like general arts interest. Charles Dickens wrote a play about the Franklin expedition. We had a lot of like poetry written about it. It became much more of like a a touchstone of like the creative arts, and I think that propagated visual culture. The mystery of it all, and I feel like the Landseer painting with the polar bears really encapsulates that. We're pushing a prevailing belief, and I try to think too of the context of these artists who are painting in the Franklin. In the case of Franklin, with the Arctic Circle being so remote, these artists were not seeing this for themselves. Photography was still very novel for many of these rescue missions. So they had to rely on the accounts of the rescue mission captains who came back, and this sort of the Victorian fantastic imagination ran rampant, and it really got legs on canvas, right? So we see a much more fantastical, imagined tableau, right? But yeah, it's certainly interesting, and at times was a little bit frustrating because I wanted to make in my mind's eye, I wanted to make more direct comparisons in terms of the works of art, just from an art history perspective. But then holding an appreciation for material culture. And I found that through the Donner Party artifacts and contrasting them with the Franklin examples. But yeah, excellent question and good points.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Sienna, both for your presentation and for all of your really thoughtful responses in this Q&A. Thank you all for being here and for submitting questions. And there were also a couple kind comments. Oh, I see we have one final question that just popped in, so maybe we'll conclude with that. Kim asks, how soon after were the artifacts collected for the Donner Party?
In the case of the Donner Party, there was scavenging that happened kind of, I won't say immediately after, but very recently, or very after the survivors had come back. There's a sort of like flurry to go up and see. But then what really kicked it off was the destruction of the cabin sites, the burning down of the cabins. And so that there was a lot of debris left over that was it made itself more available to be kind of scrounged around in and collected. And a lot of the residents of the Truckee area, which is sort of the largest city closest to Donner Lake, would go out and round up these relics, these artifacts, right? So it happened over a large swath of time. And even I found an article attesting to, archaeological digs have continued to kind of happen periodically at the site. I think they kind of feel like they found everything they can today in 2025, but and as recent as 2004, more objects were found and sifted through that can be, positively identified and attributed to the Donner Party. So we still are collecting things to some degree, perhaps, fewer and fewer as we go on. But yeah, certainly there was scavenger ants, as I said in the presentation, that kind of mucked about.
As you also said in the presentation, the story is still unfolding. It's not closed. And the story both of what is being discovered through archaeology and science about what occurred, but also the way that popular representations continue to have a hold on the public imagination, like with television shows and board games. So yeah, an ongoing story. Thank you so much, Sienna. Thank you all for being here. We will be sending out the recording of this talk shortly. And again, it will be posted on the Sutter's Fort YouTube. So I hope very much that you all will check it out and invite your friends to watch the talk as well. And stay tuned for the next in the webinar series coming up. It's a biannual series, so coming up in the next 6 months. Thank you. Bye.